Well, it's a real joy to have Tim Challies on the podcast today. And as he states on his blog, he's the husband to Eileen, father to three children. So first family comes first, 13 to 19. But he's also a well-known Christian blogger and author. And his most recent book, which we're going to talk about on this episode, is Epic, an around the world journey through Christian history. So welcome, Tim. Good to have you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I should say that I think those birthdays are slightly, or those ages are slightly out of date. At least on Sunday, we'll be 14 to 20 years old. So we've just had, or about to have birthdays.
Good, good. Well, so last year was your teen year.
Yep. Yeah, we
Yep.
had three teenagers last year. Yeah.
Well, I want to start by saying I love the title with the play on words, because you got the idea of an epic, which is a story that's something that's heroic and grand, and then of course you've got the slang usage, which just means awesome, and maybe something else in there also. But just tell me a little bit about the book itself, or the project itself, and how it came to be.
Sure. I'm glad you picked up on the double meaning of epic there. I don't know anybody else has, at least nobody else has mentioned that to me. But yeah, we wanted this to be a story that was epic in its scope, in that more colloquial sense, but also epic in that it tells a great story. And the story I wanted to tell through the book and through the videos is the story of what Christ has been doing in the world for 2,000 years and building his church. And so the book came about. I'd had this interest in church history. Well, really, first an interest in history that became an interest in church history, that became an interest in historical objects. And so as I researched history, I really became interested in objects because they have a neat way of tying the past to the present, in that you can look at an object and you know it existed then, but it still exists today. And so it sort of binds the two eras together. And so I'd done some writing about historical objects. I'd even done a little blog series about historical objects, but kept dreaming about maybe being able to actually make it more than that, go out and actually see the objects, go and find some out in the world. And thankfully, I was given the opportunity, and I was able to do that over the course of about 18 months, go around the world, 24 countries, every continent, and looking for historical objects.
Well, that's cool. So so for you, your interest was the history, historical objects, and then one thing you bring out in the book, in the videos, is except for a few times you cheat, most of these things are available to people who travel and visit the places.
Yeah, so all the objects, the stipulation was they had to be historical objects, not monuments, not things like that, and not places, which was limiting in some ways because there's whole eras of church history where there are no objects that remain. The older you get, or the more marginalized the people get, the harder it is to find. But yeah, so that was a stipulation. And yeah, it was a fascinating journey to go out and track them down, and to try and find ones that were still publicly available. So you didn't need special credentials, you didn't need to go into private collections, but anybody can go and do this. And my hope is people will do this, and maybe even look in their own backyards and see what objects they can find right there in their own hometowns or their own states, provinces, and so on.
Well, you accomplished both things with me. One was to motivate me to travel and see some of these things, and then also well, hopefully we'll have time to talk about how you did some research in your own uh, area of Toronto. I also you knew of some things in New England, and I thought, man, I haven't seen that. So yeah, it definitely gets the juices flowing. Talk a little bit. It has videos. I don't know if it'd be proper to say it comes with videos. Talk about how those two interact and why they're different, the
Sure.
same. Yeah, talk about those.
Yeah, so it began as a book project. I actually began travel to research a book, taking lots of photographs, imagining a standard book. After I'd done my first journey, Stephen McCaskill, who's a filmmaker, he got in touch and said, I think this would make a neat film or documentary project. And so he decided to come along for the journey. So instead of traveling alone, I ended up traveling with him. And instead of producing a book, we produced both a book and a documentary. They're related, but they're also independent. And so essentially, if you want to break them down, the film shows the journey, the book shows the objects themselves. So the film sort of traces us as we go around the world. It shows us just kind of navigating different countries and cultures, The book focuses in on those 33 objects we found, and through those objects tell the story of Christian history. So they're complementary, but you could also enjoy one without necessarily having the other.
So the book orderly, chronological. The videos though are not. Is that right?
Right. So the videos are arranged geographically. We went on
Yeah.
different journeys and recorded the journeys. And so sometimes you'll span great eras in church history. In Rome, you have very early church history, then you have Reformation history, so separated by 1500 years. Whereas in the book, everything is arranged neatly chronologically.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what were some of the most memorable ones that stayed with you?
Yeah, this kind of varies day by day, I think. As I think back for over an incredible year, year and a half, and just a massive variety of subjects. I often think about Amy Carmichael's Bible, which is in the archives in Northern Ireland. You can go and see it there. And it was an amazing object to see this Bible that she had used, that had been her personal Bible, full of her notes, her annotations. It's a neat piece of history to be able to see that this book that sustained her through such difficult times as she ministered in India. But then actually going to India and spending time at the ministry she founded there, to see it still going. I just got an email from my contact there a couple days ago. Things are still going well there. They're still preaching the gospel there. And seeing her library there, seeing her love of biography, seeing her Spurgeon books, that kind of thing was just was really really neat. And closer to you, things like Jonathan Edwards' six-sided Lazy Susan desk is a weird, eclectic, as weird as its owner, kind of desk. So he had a desk that had six different sides on it, so we could rotate it. You have different books open and kind of rotate through them like tabs on a browser in your computer or something. So just lots of things. Some of them very significant, some of them quirky.
Well, let's talk just a minute about the artifacts from around the New Testament era. Uh, when I had a chance to visit that part of the world, it really solidified my faith to say this is not storybook. Just as you look in Toronto and say, well, this really happened here, that those places are still around. Uh, did those artifacts solidify your faith just in terms of the historicity of what we read in the Gospels in the New Testament times?
Yeah, for sure. So as Christians, we don't need historical evidence to believe what we believe. Our faith isn't founded on pieces of rock that exist through the ages, but it does prove our faith in that sense. It does establish it, or it does shore it up. And it over the course of Christian history, there's been lots of naysayers who would find something in the Bible and say, that did not exist. There's no evidence of that ever existing. Therefore, we can disprove the whole thing, or we can show the Bible does have errors in it. So things like the Pilate stone in Jerusalem, a stone that references Pontius Pilate, that for a long time people did not believe. Many people did not believe that Pontius Pilate was a historical figure. Then one day somebody turns up a stone with his name carved on it, and now we have historic evidence that he did exist. Which for us as Christians, we kind of say, yeah, we could have told you that. We believe that out of faith because we know that every word of God is true. But now we also have further confidence in this historical record. So, yeah, it was very helpful to see those things. Now, one of the tricks, as I referenced earlier, was that early church history, much of it is gone. So a lot of early church history happened in North Africa. I couldn't find a single object in North Africa that had survived the ages. Augustine's pen isn't still around, so there's a lot of stuff I would have loved to have found but doesn't exist. But there are a few neat objects that are still there.
Well, and again, that doesn't mean some of those things won't be found. So
Right.
I remember the battle for the Bible back. One of the arguments in the 50s was that the Book of Acts, like there's no all this was in a sense made up. And then as you're talking about, whether it's written documents or in your case actual objects here, actually are verifying. So the lack of evidence does not disprove.
Right.
And we're just going to expect to find more and more things that prove it. So how personally was your faith built? So I assume this wasn't just let's go out and have fun, although it looked like a lot of fun on the videos.
Yeah, it was fun. It was also grueling and tiring in many ways and hard on the family. So it was, it had both great, I would never complain about it because it was such an amazing experience. Um, but it was difficult in some ways. It really did affect my faith on a number of levels. First, it showed me clearer than ever why we as Christians need to know our church history. When we become Christians, we join into something. I just need Christians to hear this. We are not the first generation of Christians. I mean,
Jesus,
intellectually we know that, but we can act like it.
Jesus wasn't white and American.
Exactly, exactly. So by studying church history, we realize we're joining into something. We've got brothers and sisters who, for 2,000 years, are able to teach us an awful lot. So when things happen in the world, when new theological issues arise, our first thought doesn't have to be what do we do. Our first thought can be what did they do. We can look back at history. So you and I are recording this at a time of pandemic. This is a new experience for me. I believe it's a new experience for you. We've never led families or churches through pandemics before. This is not uncommon when we think about the history of Christianity. So we've got resources we can draw upon, or recently conflicts about the Trinity in the evangelical church. Again, we've got great reserves we can draw on. So often we should be looking back before we look forward. And I think this really established that truth for me, how much we owe to our forebears.
That's great. And one of the things, just to commend the series, you make it fun, or you make it interesting. I mean, I think so many times we can associate history with being boring or being dry or that
Yeah,
type thing,
and
which
often it is. It's often a defensible critique. There is a lot of history. Some history is meant to be dry. It's certain academic history is not meant to be entertaining. It's meant to establish facts, and that's fine. But there is a lot of history that's pretty dry and pretty drab. So one thing I was really hoping for this project is it would be a kind of gateway drug into church history. You'd probably not a thing to say on a family program, but something you would try, and now it just opens up the possibilities to you. You gain an interest in an era, you gain an interest in a character, you gain an interest in the whole thing. There's tons of good resources you can get into now to go much deeper into many of these things.
well, let's talk about that just a little bit. So you are the father of three, and I know have a heart to disciple them, and you've done a good job doing that. How do you think families could use this? What's a way, or what's several different ways that we could use that?
Yeah, I've heard from families who are just reading it after dinner together, a chapter at a time. The chapters are pretty short, and I think they'll keep the attention of kids. Maybe not the youngest, but slightly older kids, kids in their tweens or teens, that kind of thing. And then people just watching the films together as well. They're pretty fast paced, and you get to see a lot of scenery, a lot of beautiful scenery, a lot of different cultures. And so I think they can have that value in just kind of keeping kids attentive for 20 or 30 minutes. But then also just introducing interesting characters. A lot of people have never heard of John Bunyan, or they haven't really heard much about his story. They're not familiar with William Wilberforce and his heroics. They don't know Josiah Henson. There's a lot of really amazing characters in church history people just don't know. And so we at heart, we like people more than ideas on the whole. Humans are interested in humans. We like stories. We like to look in on other people's lives. And church history gives us a way of doing that. We can study other people with all their strengths and all their weaknesses.
Yeah, that's so true. Just that we like thinking about other people, learning about other people. And then what struck me as I get older, may strike you later as well, which is as your kids study things as history, and you say, well, no, wait, that's not history. That I lived through that. And so part of that is this constant need to reteach things that or so you may, some of us have had some background in church history a little bit, and you think, oh yeah, well, of course everyone knows who these people are, but then to need to reteach and reintroduce them is needed. So, well, related
Well,
to
and
that.
something else to add to that is we gain more information about people over time. So we have to tell their stories in accordance with new uncovered information. And also we change as people. So a telling of some of these characters 100 years ago would vary a lot from a telling of it now as social norms have developed, as we've come to regard certain things as more virtuous or less virtuous than they may have. And so there's always retellings to be done of these people. We better understand them. We better understand their eras. We better understand their impact over the centuries. So yeah, we need to keep going back to church history, keep telling it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's finish up now. Just talk about two of the characters. So remind us again who John Bunyan is, and I want you to tell us a little bit about the sacrifice uh, on his family for the gospel. Again, we're disciple making parent. We're aimed at the families, but sometimes a family can become an idol, and everything is about the family. So talk a little bit about him. Tell
Yeah.
us Tell us about him.
Yeah, so Bunyan is best known, of course, for writing The Pilgrim's Progress, which, depending how you see it, is the most printed fictional work or the most printed book of all time, really, apart from the Bible and Mao's Little Red Book. But, one of these unexpected literary giants who wrote a book that has impacted generations. And he wrote that book while he was imprisoned. He had been imprisoned for improperly preaching without a license given out by the state church. And he was arrested and put in prison. And it was during that imprisonment that he was able to write this great work. And so we as Christians understand sometimes God uses very difficult circumstances for very great things. Well, here's a man who was in prison writing a work that has influenced and edified millions of people. Not only that, while he was in prison, his young daughter, in those days when you were in prison, your family was responsible largely to care for you. His young daughter, who was blind, would be bringing him his food day after day. And there was a little dish. She used to bring his food to him in that dish. And that dish has somehow survived the ages and is now in a little museum there in Bedford. And so you can see that dish. On the one hand, it's just a little plain earthenware dish. It doesn't really mean anything. But if you know the story, now that dish tells the story. It's an into telling the whole story of Bunyan and how he loved his daughter and his sorrow at losing his daughter, his sorrow of being separated from his family. It's incredibly evocative if you let it tell its story.
And how long was he in prison apart from his family?
I don't recall exactly,
Okay.
but it was a long time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's finish up. Talk about just the history in your area. Tell us a little bit about Josiah Henson. And you had just that wasn't an artifact, but that was just kind of a quick take you had in the book, which I just found really interesting.
Yeah, so Josiah Henson, you know of him because you've heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was a fictional work. And, as Abraham Lincoln said, the woman who wrote it was the little woman who started this great war in her own way. That book really was tremendously impactful in America and around the world. While it was a work of fiction, she based some of her key characters, including Uncle Tom, on true people. And one of those was Josiah Henson. And he was a slave who escaped slavery and first became a Christian and became a preacher, then escaped slavery and actually escaped up into Canada, as many did. You remember the Underground Railroad led north and eventually into Canada. So he escaped into Canada, settled near here, founded a settlement, and became quite a well-known and highly regarded pastor in this area. So his story I included sort of parenthetically because there wasn't that object. But yeah, there's a neat little museum for him, and a neat character that should be better known.
Super. Well, tell us how we can get the book and the videos.
Wherever good books are sold, I suppose.
Okay.
So from Amazon or Westminster Books, they'll have it. The videos maybe a little harder to find. You can get it on Amazon and DVD or rent it from Vimeo. But if you look around, you'll find it.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. There. You also have a page, and we'll link to it for where you put up all the different sources to get it. So, well, thanks for taking the time. And I have started watching the videos. I haven't completed them. I did complete the book, but I think this is going to be a great resource and a fun resource to introduce people to church history.